Welcome to the church family that is lifting lives through living love, inspiring hope, filling with faith, and transforming our world. These recorded messages are made available so that you might have additional opportunities to stay connected with us and that you might learn and grow in your faith. God bless you as you hear the word today. And now, the message.
From Genesis 2:15-17 to 3:1-7. The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it. And the Lord God commanded the man, "You are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat from it, you will certainly die." Now the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, "Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden?" The woman said to the serpent, "We may eat fruit from the trees in the garden, but God did say, 'You must not eat fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it, or you will die.'" "You will not certainly die," the serpent said to the woman, "for God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." When the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye, and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it. She also gave some to her husband, who was with her, and he ate it. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they realized they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves. May the Lord add his blessing to the reading and hearing of his word.
So if you weren't here last Sunday, we began a new series called Strong and Weak, based on a book by the same title by Andy Crouch. And if you weren't here last week, I encourage you to go back and watch the sermon either online or on podcast, because all of the sermons in this entire series will be kind of woven together. They're all interconnected. But quick recap, last week we talked about how God created us as human beings, that God created us with both vulnerability and authority. Authority we define as the capacity to take meaningful action. Vulnerability is our exposure to meaningful risk. And a lot of times we think of authority and vulnerability as opposites. Like the whole point of authority is so that we won't be vulnerable, but that's not the case. Actually, God creates us that authority and vulnerability are meant to coexist, and we actually flourish and become our best selves when both those things are present in our lives. Let me give you a quick example. A couple years ago, my father-in-law bought a basketball goal for my wife on her birthday. We set it up in the backyard, and let me just say my father-in-law was a basketball coach, high school coach, and my wife played basketball when she was in high school, so the force runs strong on that side of the family. On my side of the family, when it comes to basketball, not so much. I mean, I'm 5 foot nothing. I have like a 3-inch vertical, so I never really loved playing basketball growing up. And I didn't grow up in Indiana either, so I'd seen Hoosiers, but it wasn't like my daily dream. Like I was much more into like soccer and tennis, and so, anyways, we got this hoop in the backyard, and so I would go out and play horse with the kids. And let me just say, when I play basketball, there is no authority whatsoever. It is complete and total vulnerability, because you can make fun of me. The only flourishing that happens is at least I can laugh about it and we can laugh together. But Jamelyn, seriously, after playing once with the kids, she said, "Dave, you are never allowed ever to teach our kids how to shoot. You'll destroy them for life." And so there is all vulnerability, no authority. But if you go to the opposite end of the stream, what does it look like with all authority and no vulnerability? Well, I think of the NBA All-Star game. Like the guys that play in the NBA All-Star game, it is complete authority. Like these are the men that are at the top of their craft, their athletic ability, and every time down the court, you're seeing someone do a crazy pass or a trick shot or a dunk that's just explosive. But you know what's missing? Besides defense in the NBA All-Star game, what's missing is vulnerability. The reason they don't play defense is because it doesn't matter who wins or loses the game. There's no risk involved at all. No, contrast that with with the NBA Finals. What it's like when you have two teams at the top of their craft, high authority, but also high vulnerability, especially if it's a game 7. And I could think of countless moments where Jordan, and like he was my idol growing up, so to speak, where he would have these incredible moments against the Cavs, against the Jazz, but always this moment where in the possibility of losing, he rose to the top. And that's my point, is where there's high authority and high vulnerability, that's when human beings flourish. We are capable of creating moments that live on in our memory and in our history. And so watch the NBA Finals. See how the players compete. See how the fans cheer. See the celebration when one team finally wins. That's human flourishing, authority and vulnerability together. And so if we put them on a 2x2 grid, we looked at this briefly last week, we see that when we put authority and vulnerability on a 2x2 grid, there's lots of options for us. Where authority and vulnerability are together, we flourish, but that's not where we always live. That's not the way the world works. Sometimes you have situations where authority is very high, but there's no vulnerability at all, and that's exploiting. And often the people who are exploiting produce conditions on the opposite sides of the graph. And you have people who have all kinds of vulnerability, but no authority to do anything about it. And then, of course, there are people who withdraw, who kind of abdicate their ability, their desire to take meaningful action because they don't want to take any meaningful risks either. And so each week in this series, we're going to kind of move around this chart. We started last week with flourishing. Today, we're going to go about suffering, and in future weeks, we'll talk about withdrawing and exploiting. But today, we're going to talk about suffering. And the story of human suffering, at least in the Bible, the irony of it is that the origin of human suffering begins by us reaching for the top left quadrant, authority without vulnerability. Remember, God creates human beings, Adam and Eve, with incredible authority and vulnerability. He gives us authority, gives us dominion over every living creature on the face of the earth. And yet Adam and Eve are also created with incredible vulnerability and dependence. They're naked in the garden. And God keeps them safe as long as they are in the Garden of Eden, and he gives them one boundary, one limit. He says, there's a tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and you shall not eat its fruit, you shall not touch it, or you will die. So one day, Adam and Eve are walking around in the garden, and they come across the serpent, which the writer of Genesis says is the craftiest of all the creatures that God has made. And notice that Adam is with Eve. I know a lot of the depictions, we think of Eve being by herself, but Adam was right there by her side. He just let, like most guys, he let her do the talking, and then when things went wrong, he cast the blame on her. But the serpent reaches out to him, and the serpent instantly puts his finger on the place of vulnerability for human beings. He says, did God really tell you that you can't eat of any fruit in the garden? Did God really give you limits? And Eve responds, no, God gave us freedom. We can eat any fruit we want in the garden. There's just one fruit, the tree in the middle of the garden. We can't eat that fruit. We can't even touch it or we'll die. And then the serpent sees an opening and says, you won't die. Rather, God knows that when you eat this fruit, your eyes will be open, knowing the difference between good and evil. You'll become like God. So just pause. Remember, we were talking about authority and vulnerability, and look at the serpent's words in that light. First, he says, you will not die. There's no risk involved. I'll take away your vulnerability. Don't have to worry about that. Instead, you will become like God. I'll offer you God-like authority over your own life. This is the promise that every idol ever conceived makes to us. Every idol says, I will take away your vulnerability and I will give you authority. Andy Crouch says that's the promise of control, the ability to take an action and not risk anything in return. And if you think about this changes forever the way at least for me, the way I think about idols. Because I always thought of idols as like little statues, right? That people would worship. And I never could figure out why were they worshiping statues? Why were they worshiping idols? But idols are not just statues. John Calvin once said, the human heart is a perpetual factory of idols because we're always looking for things to take away our vulnerability and to give us control. So think of the things in our society that might qualify as idols. Drugs, for instance. Drugs take away your vulnerability. Whatever you're worried about in your life, soon you won't have to think about it anymore. And they give you a godlike sense of ecstasy and power, freedom like you've never known. Pornography gives you the authority of looking at someone else without the vulnerability of being seen. Work, which is a much more socially acceptable form of idolatry. But workaholism, think of how many people find themselves devoting themselves entirely to work because in the office they have a sense of authority and they avoid home because that's where they experience vulnerability. Or even think about these phones that we all carry around in our pocket. I mean, could these be an idol? Because I've seen it. People post things and say things on this device that they would never say face to face to another person. But when they're hidden and invulnerable, then they express authority in an entirely different way. And some people experience great vulnerability by what's said. My point is this: idols can be any object to which we give our ultimate allegiance, to which we elevate to become an object of worship. And idols always make the same promise that they will give us a shortcut to authority and safeguard us against vulnerability. And when we believe that lie, we give into the power of any idol. So Eve looks at the fruit. And the Bible says when she sees the fruit, she sees it as pleasing to the eye. And she sees that it is good for the gaining of wisdom, and so she takes the fruit and she eats it. And then she instantly spits it out and says, "That's terrible. You lied to me, serpent," right? Oh, that's not how the story goes. Instead, she eats it and says, "Wow, this is good. Adam, here, taste. You got to try some of this too." And Adam takes and he eats as well. You see, idols at the very beginning always taste good. They feel good. They deliver on what they promise. That's how they get us hooked in the first place. Andy Crouch puts it this way. He says, in the success phase, you'll never convince an idolater that his addiction is not working because it is working. It is rescuing him from his human vulnerability and delivering an intoxicating taste of invulnerable ecstasy. But the problem is that idols don't last. That feeling they give of control or power, it's an illusion. And then as idols begin to deliver less and less of the promise that they gave, we begin to chase that feeling more and more. We begin to invest ourselves more and more and more in seeking that payoff that the idol once gave to us. And this is when the idols claim our lives until ultimately we end up in the place of suffering. We grasp after authority without vulnerability, but we end up in a place where we have all vulnerability and no authority over the habits and addictions that control our lives. We're in a place of suffering. And when we're in that place of suffering, it's not just us who suffers. It's everyone who loves us, everyone who knows us, and even people that we can't even see. The ripple effects go out. And the sad thing is when we're in that place, even when we're suffering, it's not easy to get free. Andy Crouch puts it this way. He says, idols will not willingly give up their power. They extract always an exit fee. And anyone who's been caught in a pattern of addiction or in an unhealthy relationship, they know that path. I know that path. And I don't know that I've ever been caught up in an addiction per se, but I know that path. John Calvin said it right. We are constantly promoting idols in our hearts. For a long time, my idol was success. I thought as long as I was successful, then I was no longer vulnerable. But I remember reaching a point in my life where I thought I was being very successful. Everything I wanted, I'd achieved. And yet it felt empty. And I remember a moment of prayer where I was just praying to God, and it was like, I feel like the prodigal son, face down in the pigs. I'd hired myself out to the wrong master. I'd been promised life that was truly life, and yet what I received was not life at all. That's what idols bring us to each and every time. So how do you know? I mean, how do you know if it's an idol? Because success in and of itself isn't bad. Work in and of itself isn't bad. Phones in and of themselves aren't bad. How do we know if these objects or patterns or relationships, how do we know if they've been elevated to the point of becoming an idol in our lives? Well, here's a litmus test. What happens for Adam and Eve after they take the fruit and eat? They're instantly ashamed, and they go and hide. And their relationship with God, the relationship which gave them security and meaning, that relationship is broken. You see, Adam and Eve made a choice, and it's a choice that we all make. They chose control over trust and relationship. They chose, we want to do what we want to do instead of trusting in what God tells us is right and true. They chose an illusion over something that was genuine and real. You see, it's in relationships where we really experience vulnerability and authority together. It's in a relationship that I have the authority of seeing someone else. It's in a relationship that I have the vulnerability of being seen. And because relationships are where we truly experience human flourishing, they are the first thing that an idol will kill. They will kill our relationships right off the bat in order to isolate us and make us even more in the grip of its power. So if you want to know, am I caught in the grip of an idol or not? Take a look at your relationships. Are you becoming more and more open and vulnerable to others? Are the core relationships in your life growing deeper and deeper, or are they becoming less and less real and meaningful? Are they becoming more and more surface? If so, you may be in the grip of an idol. And if you are in the grip of an idol, then what do you do next? I mean, how do you get free? If you are in a place where you are all vulnerability and no authority, I mean, I think most of us will think, well, the way to right that ship is to reclaim our authority, to take control of our lives back, to exert our willpower and break the power of whatever idol may be going on in our lives. But that doesn't actually work, because that's just a grasping after control again. It's an illusion. No, the paradoxical piece of this is that when we're in that place where there's no authority, the correct answer is to submit to God's authority. Addicts know this, those who've gone through a 12-step process, because the very first step is to recognize that on their own will they can't break free, but instead they have to recognize a higher power to whom they can turn. Paul puts it this way in the book of Romans. He says, "Do you not know that if you present yourselves to anyone as obedient slaves, you are slaves of the one you obey? So you must no longer present yourselves to sin as instruments of wickedness, but instead present yourselves to God as those who have been brought from death to life. Then sin will have no dominion over you." The reality is that every single one of us made the same choice as Adam and Eve. At some point, we've chosen that shortcut to power. We have submitted ourselves to the master of sin. And on our own, we can't break that power in our lives. The only choice we have is whether or not we will submit our lives to a higher power, to Christ, who broke the power forever. Hey, remember I said every idol will extract an exit fee from us? Christ paid our exit fee by dying on the cross. And so the choice we have is not to free ourselves, but rather to just submit to the one who already paid the price to set us free. And so the first thing we have to do is submit to God's authority in our lives. And that means that rather than stepping into authority, what we need to do is step into vulnerability. When Adam and Eve had sinned, and they made coverings for themselves and they disappeared into the garden, and Adam sought the mountains, or God sought them out and said, Adam, where are you? I love that God asked, Adam, where are you? God knew exactly where Adam was. He knew exactly where Eve was. He knew exactly what they had done. And yet he gave them the opportunity to self-identify, to step out of the leaves and say, here we are. And God does the same for us. He might be asking you this morning, where are you? And you have the opportunity, same as Adam and Eve, to step out and say, here I am. I know I've messed up. I know I've sought control of my own life. I know I've worshiped something or someone else. And yet I confess that I'm sorry and I ask you, God, to set me free and to make me whole. The path to our wholeness begins when we step into vulnerability and simply tell God who we are and where we are. And then we discover that God does not reject us, but God embraces us and loves us and sets us free. I'm going to close the message today with a story, but it's not my story. It's a story of a man named Jim Reiser, who's a good friend of Andy Simons, who does our tech booth every week. And when we were talking about the theme of this message, Andy said, you got to talk to my friend Jimmy. And as you listen to Jim's story in just a moment, I don't necessarily want you to focus on the particulars of his own journey through addiction, but rather focus on his path to wholeness and healing. Because the same step of submission, the same step of vulnerability, it's the step that every single one of us has to make in order to recognize we all have idols. We all have things that we've given power to in our lives, and yet God calls us and asks us, will we submit, will we trust, and will we let him set us free? Here's Jim's story.
My name is Jim Reiser, and I am a recovering drug addict. I had some issues with my kidneys where they ended up giving me some Percocet, which is a narcotic drug. And I remember the first time I took that drug, I was like, wow, I do not like how I feel. I do not like how I feel. I remember staying in bed and laying down and, oh gosh, I'll be glad when this wears off. Well, I had the surgery. It was a successful surgery. Fast forward 6, 8, maybe 10 months. And I had a really bad migraine headache. And so I naturally found, what was left of that bottle and took a couple of those. And it was like a switch. It was like, wow, I feel great for the first time in my life. And for the first time, I had no pain. Secondly, I had this feeling of, I can do anything. And I actually went down and worked in the studio and wrote a couple of songs, and I just had this energy that was just, it was not clear to me at the time, but it was false. It was completely false. And I can remember being on tour. We were touring with the Moody Blues. The most important part of my night was getting those 2 pain medications. I had 2 Percocets that I was allowed to take at night. And not that I earned them, that's not where I was, but that was more important to me than anything else I was doing. It's like, if it was a good show, the Percocets made it a better show. If it was a bad show, it took the sting off of a bad show. Everybody protected me from cocaine, from marijuana, from all these other drugs. And I wouldn't do them either because I was medically, a bit of an anomaly. And here I was as addicted as the day is long to pain medications. Nobody really questioned my pain. And I didn't question, I had pain. And yet these medicines were not medicines to me. They were a lie. They were an absolute lie. And that's the big lie of addiction is, I can control this. I was my own higher power for so long. I can control this. I can manage this. Oh shoot, I ran out. I got to get another script. And then it was just exhausting. I mean, being addicted is a full-time job. And I think that, once you took the guitar away from me and once you took all these things away from me and just saw me for who I was, My belief system was, if you really knew me, you would hate me. And so I never really ever let anybody know me. The addict is a double, triple, quadruple life sometimes. You know, you have what you show the world. I'm Jimmy Reiser, the rock star, and then privately, Jim Reiser, the loser, who can't control his drug use. What a loser! What an absolute loser! You suck. You have a huge ego and no self-esteem. And ego stands for easing God out. And so you shrink your ego and you get your self-esteem and you find out who you really are. I was in pain rehab again. I went through pain management, and I remember telling the doctor, I always get a little emotional when I think about this. But I told him I didn't need pain management this time. I think I needed the other side. And he said, I think I know what you need. And if your insurance doesn't pay for it, I'll pay for it myself. And the reason I get tearful about that is because I made a vow at that time to pass that forward for the rest of my life. I have to remember that part of God's will for me is to help others. And so the change that has occurred over time is the ability to let others in, as uncomfortable as it is, the ability to give of yourself, as uncomfortable as it is, the ability to forgive, as horrifically uncomfortable as that was, because not forgiving let me hold on to things that made it okay for me to keep using. And then finally letting go. And when they say let go and let God, that's a powerful thing, because it's like, okay, I really do surrender. I'm going to trust God's journey for me. And then you just go on it.
Been walking the razor's edge, I cut my feet again. Now I can't stand on my own. I wish that I could be the truth you are to me, but I've been cold as a stone. Even though I lost my way, you still got an open hand to hold. I really can't go on acting this way. Can you help me find my way home? Can't stand the thought of being alone. Trying to find my way to get on my feet again. But lately it seems hopeless. I feel like I've been mistreated, wound up feeling cheated, because I've been so careless. Ever since you came my way, felt a spark of a chance to hold. I take your hand and you guide my way. Jesus, help me find my way home. Help me find my way home. And you say you'll stay at my side. I no longer have the need to hide. If I can only let go of my pride, I could see how you help my fears subside. How will I ever thank you for all the things that you do and giving me the chance to walk with you hand in hand, to let my sadness end. Please keep my heart in your hands. I hope that I can give to you the selfless love that you have sown. The seeds of love will grow straight and true, 'cause you help me find my way home. Help me find